Emergency nurse calls police on panicked patient, but they aim guns at the doctor who saved him. The first gun pointed at him felt almost surreal, like a scene from a nightmare stitched together by someone else's fear. It was 3:17 a.m. when Dr. Malcolm Reed's world split in two. Not because of a scalpel, but because of the color of his skin. Malcolm had just finished resuscitating a patient who'd coded in Trauma Bay 3, one of those moments where time folded in on itself and instinct took over. Adrenaline still burned in his muscles, his scrubs soaked in blood, latex gloves discarded, and the overhead lights still humming when chaos exploded behind him. "Get on the ground!" someone screamed. He turned slowly, half expecting to see another combative patient. But instead there were guns. 3 police officers, one with his knee bent, finger already half pulled on the trigger, another yelling into a radio. The third, the youngest, had eyes wide with panic and fury, and every single one of them was aiming at Malcolm. "Hands up! Now!" He froze. "What the hell is happening?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp with shock. That's when he saw Jalen, the patient, sitting up on the gurney, trembling, his hospital gown ripped open, a monitor still beeping beside him. Jalen's chest heaved, and his eyes darted wildly. But no one was looking at him. All attention was on the doctor who had just cracked his ribs and brought him back to life. Malcolm raised his hands slowly. "I'm the physician on call. I'm the one who—" "Shut up!" barked the officer in front, stepping closer. "You match the description. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Description?" Malcolm blinked. "Of who?" But the answer didn't matter. His white coat didn't matter. His ID badge still clipped to his collar didn't matter. His Harvard degree, his residency at Johns Hopkins, the years of sleep deprivation and sacrifice, none of it mattered. All they saw was a tall, black man in a room where someone was screaming. Earlier that night, before the madness, Malcolm had eaten his dinner, a soggy turkey sandwich, in the break room with Olivia, the night shift nurse who had joined the ER team only a few weeks prior. She was new to city trauma, fresh-faced, tightly wound, and polite in a way that made Malcolm feel like he had to speak softly around her. She had asked him then, between bites of her salad, "Do you ever get scared here? Working nights, I mean." Malcolm had shrugged. "Only when the vending machine eats my money." She laughed, tight and quick. "No, I mean with, the types of patients we get." He'd paused, feeling a tension under her words. "They're people, Olivia, same as you and me, just hurting in different ways." Now, standing in front of those police guns, that conversation echoed bitterly in his ears. The situation unraveled fast. The charge nurse, Rosa, burst into the trauma room, shouting, "He's a doctor! What the hell are you doing?" But they didn't lower their weapons. Not right away, because Olivia had called 911. Her voice had been shaky but certain on the dispatch recording later reviewed. "There's a black male in Trauma 3 threatening a patient. He's not supposed to be in there. I think he might be violent." She hadn't recognized him. That was her excuse. "I didn't know it was Dr. Reed," she said later, eyes wide, voice small. "He wasn't wearing his coat. He looked. I was scared." It didn't matter that Malcolm had been the one leading the code, that the patient had been flatlining until his fingers worked through cracked ribs and adrenaline. Olivia had seen a black man hovering over a nearly unconscious patient, and something in her mind decided danger. So she made the call, and the system responded like it always does. Back in the trauma bay, Malcolm had to keep his hands up for nearly 90 seconds. 90 seconds of humiliation, of being stripped down not just of dignity but of humanity. It took Rosa shouting, the patient himself crying, "That's the doctor saved me, he saved me," for the officers to finally lower their guns. But not before one of them asked, "You got ID?" Malcolm stared. "You mean like the badge hanging from my neck?" No apology came, no handshake, just a quiet mutter, "You're good," as if they were letting him off for a crime he hadn't committed. Malcolm didn't lower his hands right away. He couldn't. They were shaking too much. Outside the trauma bay, Rosa pulled him into the hallway. "I'm so sorry, Malcolm." He didn't answer, because what was there to say? What would Sorry fix? He sat alone in the on-call room for 15 minutes before scrubbing his hands raw. The blood on his arms wasn't Jalen's anymore. Felt like something else entirely. By morning, the story had already started to spread. Hospital staff whispered. Jalen's family wanted answers. HR scheduled an emergency meeting. And Malcolm? He kept working. Not because he wanted Tobit, because what else was there to do? Patients kept coming. Lives still needed saving. He stitched a forehead, realigned a shoulder, reviewed charts. But something in him had cracked something deeper than bone. It wasn't until 2 days later that the hospital held its incident review. A sterile room, fluorescent lights, and a long table with people who used the word protocol like a shield. "We have to look at this objectively," the HR director said. The nurse acted on what she perceived to be a threat. It was a misidentification, unfortunate, but not malicious. Malcolm's jaw clenched. Not malicious? I was nearly killed because she thought I didn't belong in my own ER. The director held up her hands. "We understand it was traumatic. We're offering counseling. I don't need therapy. I need accountability." Silence. Then someone from legal chimed in. "We'd prefer to handle this internally. No need to escalate." That word again. Escalate. Like Malcolm was the one raising his voice. Like he hadn't spent years lowering it so people wouldn't feel threatened by it. Later that week, Malcolm stood outside the hospital during sunrise. Jalen had been discharged, left a note. Shaky handwriting thanking Malcolm for saving his life. It ended with, "I'm sorry they pointed guns at you instead of me. I was the one screaming." Malcolm folded the note in half and put it in his pocket. Behind him, the world was waking up, sirens in the distance, garbage trucks rolling, and the smell of burnt coffee leaking from the cafeteria. He didn't know if he could keep doing this, but he also knew somewhere deep inside that walking away would mean letting silence win. And silence, more than fear, was the real killer. The emails started arriving the next morning. First, it was 1 or 2 quiet messages from staff, a few lines long. "Just heard what happened. Can't believe it. You handled it with more grace than most of us could. Sorry you had to go through that, Malcolm. That never should have happened. If there's anything I can do." But then they kept coming. By the end of the day, Malcolm had over 40 emails, all saying different versions of the same thing. Some sincere, some vague, some using words like unfortunate and misunderstanding so frequently it made him nauseous. He didn't want pity. He wanted justice. Or, at the very least, acknowledgement that the system had failed again. It was Wednesday night when Malcolm walked into the ER break room and found Olivia sitting alone, clutching a steaming cup of tea like it was an anchor. She looked up the second he stepped in, her face draining of color. "Dr. Reed." He held up a hand. "Don't. I didn't recognize you. I was scared." He exhaled. "You weren't scared. You were conditioned." Her brows knit. "What do you mean?" "You saw a black man in trauma. Blood on his hands. No coat. And something in your mind said, threat. Not doctor. Not colleague. Not the guy you ate dinner with 2 hours before. 2 didn't mean. I know you didn't mean to, but you did. That's the problem." She looked down at her tea. "I'm sorry." He nodded. But not out of forgiveness, just acknowledgement. He wasn't ready for forgiveness. He didn't know if he ever would be. 2 nights later, Malcolm met Jalen again, not in a trauma bay, but in a coffee shop 5 blocks from the hospital. The young man looked better. Thinner, paler, but alive. There were bandages still taped to his ribs, and a stiffness to his movements that reminded Malcolm of the code, of the cracked ribs and paddles, of how close they'd come to losing him. "I wasn't going to reach out," Jalen said, cradling a paper cup. "But my cousin saw what happened on Twitter. Then it hit the local news. Then my mom saw it." "It's fine," Malcolm said quietly. "I'm glad you're okay." Jalen swallowed. "They didn't say much at the hospital. About the cops. About what happened to you. They won't." "Why not?" "Because it's easier to sweep it under the rug. Pretend it was just a mistake. A mix-up. Something to forget." Jalen leaned forward. "But I saw it. You saved me. And they came in like you were the criminal. You were the only one who wasn't panicking. Malcolm offered a hollow smile. I've had practice. By the end of the week, the hospital released a carefully worded statement. We take all allegations of racial profiling seriously. The incident in Trauma Bay 3 is currently under review, and we remain committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion at every level of care. Malcolm read it twice and laughed, bitterly. Review, commitment, diversity, all the right words, none of the right actions. But outside the sterile walls of the hospital, people weren't staying quiet. A resident from pediatrics posted a thread on social media. Then a nurse from the ICU. Then a janitor who'd worked in the ER for 15 years and said, "This isn't the first time." Within days, a protest formed outside the hospital's main entrance. Small at first, just 10 or 12 people holding handmade signs. But by Monday, the crowd had grown. Doctors in white coats, nurses in scrubs, former patients, activists, neighbors, college students, black, white, brown, standing together. Malcolm stood on the third floor and looked down at the street, his heart caught somewhere between shame and awe. One sign read, "Black doctors deserve to live too." Another, "He saved a life and nearly lost his own." And another, "Trust black caregivers." He pressed his fingers to the glass, unsure if he wanted to join them or hide from them. That evening, he got a call from a reporter. "Dr. Reed, this is Kara Simmons with Channel 9. I was hoping you'd comment on the recent incident at Mercy General. The community is really rallying around you." "I'm not looking for fame," he said. "Of course, but your voice could help others understand what happened and why it matters." He hesitated. "Let me think about it." That night, he didn't sleep. The next morning, he walked into the ER and felt the shift in the air. People looked at him longer. Some nodded. Others avoided eye contact. In Trauma Bay 4, he worked a gunshot wound with a nurse named Charlie, an old friend from residency who'd transferred in from Detroit last year. "You good?" Charlie asked, glancing at him over the patient's chest. Malcolm nodded. "Just tired." Charlie pressed gauze to a bleeder. "Everyone's talking, you know? I figured. You should speak. While they're listening." Malcolm stared at the rhythm on the monitor. "You think they'll actually hear me?" "Doesn't matter," Charlie said. "Say it anyway." He agreed to the interview. They met in a quiet park near Malcolm's apartment. Just him, the reporter, and a cameraman. No flashing lights. No setup. Just honest words. Kara asked gentle but firm questions. "What were you thinking in that moment? Have you experienced anything like this before? What do you want people to take away from this?" Malcolm didn't sugarcoat it. "I wasn't surprised," he said. "I was angry, but not shocked, because it doesn't matter how many degrees I have, or how many lives I save. The second someone sees me as a threat, I become one. And what would you say to people who think this was just an unfortunate accident?" He looked into the lens. "I'd say, how many accidents does it take before you realize the system is working exactly how it was built?" The interview aired that night. By morning, it had 1.2 million views. The hospital called him in. This time, it wasn't HR. It was the chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Ginsburg who'd been at Mercy for 27 years. Old school, blunt, known for making surgeons cry during grand rounds. She gestured for him to sit. "I saw the interview." Malcolm sat carefully. "And I think you were right." He blinked. "I don't say that often," she added. "And I won't say it again." "Why now?" "Because the world's watching. Because you've sparked something. And because I've been silent too long myself." She slid a document across the table. "We're proposing a task force. Independent review. Bias training for all staff. Real reform. And I want you to help lead it." He stared at the folder. "You want me to fix the system that almost killed me?" "No. I want you to help change it." He picked up the folder slowly. "I'll think about it." That night, he went for a walk through the neighborhood. Every few blocks, someone recognized him. A woman nodded and whispered, Thank you. A teenager flashed him a peace sign. An older man clapped his shoulder and said, You stood tall, brother. Malcolm didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't trying to be a symbol. He just didn't want to die doing the thing he loved. When he got home, he found an envelope in his mailbox. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Your story saved my son. He wants to be a doctor now. No name, no contact, just that one line. He sat on his stoop under the streetlight, holding the letter in both hands. For the first time since that night, he let himself cry. Not from fear, but from hope. Monday morning began with a protest so large the hospital had to reroute ambulances. It wasn't just Mercy General's ER anymore. It was a national story. CNN ran a headline, Black doctor mistaken for threat in his own hospital. Malcolm sat in his office, the blinds drawn. He could hear the chants from the street even 6 stories up. Protect black doctors. No more silence. Malcolm Reed, we stand with you. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a man who hadn't slept in for nights. The emails kept coming this time from strangers. Some were warm. Others were loaded with anger. A few anonymous threats trickled in too, buried between subject lines like, You're an inspiration, and liar in a lab coat. Dr. Ginsburg had asked him again to lead the hospital's new reform task force. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no either. That afternoon, he ran into Rosa near the elevators. She looked worn, like she hadn't stopped moving since the incident. She reached out, squeezed his arm. You okay? He nodded slowly. Surviving. They've suspended Olivia. He blinked. What? Pending investigation, Rosa said. But some of the board members think she was just following instinct. They're protecting her. Of course they were. Instinct, Malcolm repeated bitterly. Interesting how that word only seems to excuse fear when it's white and directed at black skin. Rosa didn't respond. She didn't need to. Later that day, he received a text from Jalen. City Hall's holding a town meeting on racial bias in healthcare. You going? Malcolm stared at it for a long time. Don't know. Should I? You're already leading. You just haven't said yes to it yet. The meeting was held in a downtown auditorium that hadn't been filled since the mayor's re-election rally. But tonight it was packed. Nurses, EMTs, paramedics, residents, people in white coats, people in jeans, people in wheelchairs, people with questions. There was a panel. Malcolm was invited to sit on it. He almost said no. He almost sat in the back. But something in him shifted when he walked through those doors and saw the mural on the wall. A giant pair of hands holding up a heart, with the words care without fear written across it. He stepped up to the stage. The first question came from a woman in the 3rd row. What made you speak out? He didn't hesitate. I didn't want to die in silence. Gasps, murmurs, some applause. Another question. What can we do? Malcolm's voice was steady now. Don't just say you support us, fight with us. Demand better hiring. Transparent policy, education that includes the truth. When your colleague jokes about thugs in the waiting room, call them out. When someone dismisses a black patient's pain, say something. Don't wait for a gun to be pointed at a doctor before you care. The crowd erupted. Someone in the back stood and shouted, Say it again, Doc. Malcolm smiled faintly. We don't need allies. We need accomplices. The next morning, the hospital board scheduled an emergency session. Malcolm was invited not just to attend, but to speak. He was escorted into the conference room by Dr. Ginsburg. Inside, a dozen board members sat in silence, flipping through neatly printed packets titled, Proposal for Racial Equity and Bias Reform at Mercy General Hospital. Malcolm stood at the front of the room and looked each of them in the eye. I know what some of you are thinking, he began. This is a PR crisis. We need to act fast, say the right things, fix our image. He let that hang for a beat. But this isn't just about image. This is about lives. Mine, Jalen's, the next black patient who walks through our doors, the next black nurse mistaken for janitorial staff, the next med student who's told he doesn't look like a doctor. This system isn't broken. It was built this way, and we've all been complicit. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others stared down at their folders. I'm not here to beg. I'm here to offer a path forward, but only if you're willing to walk it. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, policy recommendations, accountability structures, third-party auditing, community advisory board inclusion, anonymous reporting protections. Dr. Ginsburg added quietly, "We've already got community leaders ready to support the rollout, but it needs your vote." Silence. Then slowly hands went up. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. The Reform Task Force was made official that Friday. Malcolm accepted the co-chair position. He insisted on Jalen being included in community advisory sessions. He brought in Black therapists to lead support groups for both staff and patients. He made it hospital policy that racial bias training be renewed annually, not just once during onboarding. He didn't fix everything, but he cracked the door open. And for once, no one tried to shut it. Weeks passed. Olivia's suspension ended, but she didn't return to Mercy. Word was, she transferred to a smaller hospital out in the suburbs. She left a note in Malcolm's mailbox. "I won't ask you to forgive me. I just want you to know I'm learning. And I'm listening now." He didn't respond, but he hoped she meant it. One Sunday morning, Malcolm sat in a church pew he hadn't visited in years. Not for religion, but for rhythm. The choir sang with voices like thunder. The pastor's sermon wasn't about forgiveness, but truth. "Some people want you to move on before you've even healed," he said. "But God doesn't call us to forget. He calls us to remember, so we never repeat." Malcolm sat there, still and quiet, as something inside him unclenched. That night, he walked the same route past the hospital where it had all happened. The trauma bay window was dark. A shift change was happening. Sirens wailed in the distance. He stood outside the emergency room doors for a long moment. Then he stepped inside. Charlie was there, leaning against the nurse's station. "You're back." Malcolm nodded. "Feels weird." Charlie chuckled. "You're still chief of emergency. You've got a badge and everything." Malcolm pulled the ID from his pocket and clipped it to his coat. "You ready?" Charlie asked. "Not really." Charlie slapped his back. "Too bad. We've got a stabbing in Bay 1 and a seizure coming up from triage. Welcome home." Malcolm smiled for the first time in weeks. He walked into the trauma room head high, coat swaying, hands steady. And this time, no one pointed a gun. 2 months passed. The protests died down. The news cycle moved on. The hashtags faded into the algorithmic ether. But Malcolm Reed stayed. Not because it was easy. Not because everything had changed. But because some things finally had. The trauma bays were still cold. The fluorescent lights still buzzed like insects. The coffee still tasted like battery acid. But now, when Malcolm walked the halls, people looked him in the eye. Some with guilt, some with pride, but most with something close to respect. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just tolerated, was heard. The Reform Task Force met every Thursday night, in the same boardroom where the silence used to be louder than the sirens. Now, the voices were diverse, bold, sometimes heated, but never silenced. They reviewed data, disparities in treatment based on race, patient complaints dismissed without documentation, hiring patterns skewed in favor of comfort over competence. They brought in third-party trainers, real ones, not those checkbox slideshow consultants with stock photos and 5 slides on allyship. These were people who understood that equity wasn't about kindness. It was about justice. Jalen sat in on every third meeting, offering feedback no administrator could have imagined. He reminded them, "Don't just make it easier to report racism, make it harder for it to survive here at all." Malcolm looked at him sometimes and saw not a patient, but a future leader. But change doesn't come without backlash. 3 surgeons threatened to resign. 1 longtime donor pulled funding from a pediatric wing. A local news columnist wrote a scathing op-ed titled, "Woke Medicine is Killing Merit." Malcolm didn't flinch. "We're not losing talent. he told Dr. Ginsburg. We're shedding rot. She nodded. Let them walk. We'll hold the door. In October, the American Medical Association invited Malcolm to speak at a national conference on systemic bias in healthcare. He almost declined. He didn't want to be a mascot. But when he looked out over the invitation list and saw over 24 black medical students registered to attend, he changed his mind. He stood at the podium and looked at the sea of white coats, some jaded, some curious, some expectant. My name is Dr. Malcolm Reed, he began. And 2 months ago, I was nearly killed by the system I've dedicated my life to serving. Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the reverent kind. He told the story, not just of the night in Trauma Bay 3, but of everything before, everything after. He described the isolation of being the only black attending in a room full of peers who still mispronounced his name, still joked about urban patients as if they weren't talking about real lives. He spoke of code switching in operating rooms, of being questioned by security when wearing scrubs and no ID, of what it felt like to resuscitate a man only to be mistaken for his attacker. But this isn't a sob story, he said. This is a call to arms. If you're not prepared to confront your own bias, you shouldn't be holding a scalpel. If you think being colorblind is noble, you've already failed the test. The room gave him a standing ovation, not because he said what they expected, but because he said what they needed. When he returned home, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from a medical student at Howard University. You reminded me why I started this journey. Thank you for staying when so many of us feel forced to leave. He taped it to his refrigerator. One night, Jalen showed up at the ear knot as a patient, but in blue scrubs, a stethoscope slung around his neck like a medal. I got into the accelerated EMT program, he said, grinning. They placed me here. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. You sure you want to come back to the place that nearly killed you? Jalen's smile widened. You came back. They bumped fists. December rolled in with biting wind. Mercy General held its first Equity in Action Summit, and for the first time in its 85-year history, the keynote was delivered by a black physician. Malcolm stood beneath the hospital's seal and told a new story, not of trauma, but of transformation. Change doesn't come in a single moment, he said. It comes in pressure, in persistence, in the refusal to forget. He looked out at the crowd, doctors, janitors, students, community members. And we will not forget, because silence almost killed me, but your voices brought me back. The trauma room where it all began now had a new plaque on the wall. Trauma Bay 3, dedicated to those who fight for equity under pressure. In honor of Dr. Malcolm Reed. He didn't ask for it, but when he saw it, he wept. Not because it glorified him, but because it meant they finally saw him. On New Year's Eve, he stood on the roof of the hospital with Charlie, watching fireworks crack the sky. Can't believe we made it, Charlie said, sipping from a thermos. We didn't, Malcolm replied. We're still making it. They stood in silence for a long while, the bursts of red and gold painting the air. Charlie asked, if you could go back, would you still have walked into that room that night? Malcolm thought of Jalen, of the task force, of every young black med student who'd sent him a message that said, you give me hope. He nodded. I'd do it again. And with that, he turned, stepped back into the warmth of the hospital, and walked toward whatever came next, not as a victim of the system, but as its reckoning, the end.